Before I move on to the main topic of this lecture, which is Ottonian art, I want to return briefly to Charlemagne's palace chapel at Aachen and the comparison with San Vitale. In my last lecture, I focused on the ways in which Charlemagne had deliberately imitated the Byzantine masterpiece, especially the double octagonal design. I also noted that the chapel at Aachen did not have a dome. I just listened, though, to a lecture on Carolingian and Ottonian art, and it made a point I wanted to share. Charlemagne's design is much darker and heavier. In some ways, it more resembles the traditional Roman style of the Pantheon than the light-filled and heavily decorated Byzantine San Vitale. The lecturer used the term muscular to describe the Carolingian style. I like that term. If San Vitale is a monument to Emperor Justinian's spiritual and political power, the palace chapel at Aachen is perhaps more a monument to Charlemagne's military might. We'll see this theme continue as we look at more Western medieval art. When Charlemagne died, he divided his empire among his three sons, following the inheritance tradition of the Franks, but really messing up his empire. Subsequent heirs would squabble over boundaries for the next 200 years, ultimately destroying the Carolingian Empire in the West. What would one day be France broke apart into a large number of feudal counties, ruled over by lords and their vassals. This is the traditional feudalism you learned about, I'm sure, last year. France acquired a new line of kings, the Capetians, but initially their rule did not extend much beyond Paris. In the East, a new line of Saxon rulers would reclaim the title of Holy Roman Emperor, starting with Otto I in 962. Now, the Ottonians did not face nearly as many Viking invasions, which I should have listed as another reason why the Carolingian Empire disintegrated. Their territory was simply harder for the Norsemen to reach, but they did successfully repel invasions from the east, most notably the fierce Magyars. And in fact, it was his victory over the Magyars that led Otto to become the Saxon king and to found the Ottonian Empire. Like the Carolingians, the Ottonians would push to establish strong ties to the papacy. They would reform the church, and they would back monastic reformers who sought to restore discipline to the monastery. So they continued in Charlemagne's tradition of allying with the church, which was really the one source of literacy and learning at the time, and continuing to promote the arts. Under the Ottonians, church architecture remained basilican in form. Note the long rectangular nave, but the trend toward adding towers and westwork continued. Byzantine churches had added vertical space largely through domes. Western European basilican churches were high-ceilinged, but the ceilings themselves were generally flat and constructed of timber beams. So the imposing external verticality came increasingly in the form of taller facades and towers. Notice that this church includes a second-floor gallery in between the columned arcades and the clerestory windows that let in light at the very top of the nave. So I should have said this is an Ottonian church from 970. The alternate support system is basically created by alternating columns, which are slender and elegant, with much heavier piers, which of course can hold a lot more weight. But this leads the eye upward, as does that second floor gallery. So what we see is what's sometimes referred to as the verticalization of the nave. And in the next unit, we'll see even more soaring interiors. So here's another must-know church. Just looking at, for now, at its exterior, what features do you notice? How has church architecture further evolved? Well, your art history textbook doesn't use this term, so you shouldn't either, but this church has both eastworks and westworks. Put more technically, and this will be clearer when you see the floor plan in the next slide, it has two transepts, or wings, that are perpendicular to the nave. It also has two sets of towers, which is easier to see in the inset picture on top. Here you see the double transept more clearly, with towers punctuating the short ends of each. Notice that the entrances are on the long side of the nave, which is similar to the pattern with the Roman basilica, but unlike most basilican churches, we usually enter on the short side opposite the one with the apse. So just by looking at this floor plan, can you guess why the architect might have decided to make the entrance along the long side of the rectangle? Well, this church has a double apse as well. So now you have the major characteristics of Ottonian basiican construction or architecture. You have a multiplication of towers, a double transept and apse, the alternation of columns and heavier piers as supports. By the way, that's shown on the floor plan as smaller circles and larger squares, and an increasing emphasis on verticality, which will continue on into the Romanesque and even more into the Gothic period. So here again, you see that soaringly vertical nave. The beautifully painted timber ceiling, by the way, is one of the reasons why this church was named a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So what does this nave lack that we saw in the Church of St. Cyriacus on our last slide, reproduced here on the right? It does not have a second floor gallery. I actually think that makes it seem even more vertical, but it may just be it's a higher ceiling. Okay, this one shows up a lot on the AP Art History exams, hint, hint. This is the most famous element of St. Michael's Church. The abbot of this monastery, this is an abbey church, was Otto III's tutor and a notable scholar. As tutor, he had many opportunities, or actually he had an important opportunity, I may be wrong about many, opportunities to travel to Rome and see some of the masterworks of classical and early Christian art, including probably the beautiful carved doors of Santa Sabina. Here are some of Santa Sabina's doors, just to give you some idea of what blew Bishop Bernard away. You saw Santa Sabina, by the way, in the first chapter of this unit, and we looked at an element from these doors. I found this slide. I thought it was fun to see more pictures of the scenes being portrayed. This didn't blow up as well as I'd hoped, but here is on the left is the Exodus from Egypt, drowning of the Pharaoh, Aaron with, serpents, is that right? I'm not sure I can even read that properly. And then on the right is the crucifixion scene that you saw before. I'm just trying to give you a sense of the enormous detail and the narrative power of these doors. We're going to encounter a lot of narrative doors in this course, most significantly when we get to the Renaissance. Anyway, back to the bronze doors of St. Michael's. Bronze doors were fairly common in ancient Rome. The Pantheon, for example, had, and it still has, bronze doors, so the doors you would see today date from the 15th century. Byzantine churches sometimes had bronze-plated doors. In other words, bronze reliefs were cast, and then they were attached to wooden doors. What's remarkable about these doors at St. Michael's of Hildesheim is that they are cast as a single piece using the lost wax casting method. Therefore, they represent a really huge recovery of an ancient technology. These were the first decorated bronze doors cast in one piece in all the West since Roman time. Okay, this is a little hard to read, particularly in the printed form, but it does give a plan of the doors. And what you see is that the doors follow a strictly organized iconographic program. This was very deliberate. On the left side, there are 8 panels with displays from Genesis, from top to bottom: creation of Eve, introduction of Eve to Adam, temptation, God accuses Adam and Eve, exile from the Garden of Eden, Adam farms the land, and Eve raises the children, offering to Cain and Abel, Cain murders Abel. On the right side, the displays are read in reverse order, bottom to top. And they display scenes from the life of Christ: the Annunciation, the birth, adoration of the kings, apparition in the temple, Christ before Pilate, nailing to the cross, the 3 Marys on the grave, and Nola me tangere, don't touch me, Christ's message to his disciples when he's ascending. These narrative displays from the Old and New Testament are symbolically interconnected by a horizontal line. So, for example, the scene where God takes Adam's rib to create Eve is horizontally lined with Christ appearing on the grave after the resurrection, which alludes that the Spirit gains back material form. And you can see the other parallels here. Let's look a little more closely at the accusation and judgment of Adam and Eve, which art historians seem to think is the greatest of these really masterful panels. So what classical elements do you see? Well, the drapery molding God's legs is shown very realistically, as are the legs, although I'm not sure theologically that God has legs. We also see clear, if rather stylized, landscape elements. Again, notice that the Byzantine art, those landscape elements had tended to disappear. The way the upper bodies seem to jump out of the relief is typical of Carolingian art. But the highly emotional and expressive faces are more typical of the later Byzantine art, and we'll see more of this when we move into Gothic and Romanesque styles. Notice, too, the highly expressive use of empty space in this. I mean, it's not really entirely empty. You kind of see the swirling forms. Something has been sculpted into the bronze. But it's a really heavily charged distance between God and Adam. And it's really important in looking at art to understand that negative space, things that are not filled, or a space that is not occupied by a sculpture, is an important element of the work as well. Notice, too, the succession of pointing figures. God at Adam, Adam at Eve, Eve at the serpent. These kinds of details really capture the narrative. And remember that for many people, this would have been the way they knew the biblical narrative. Here's the creation of Adam and Eve, complete with a Dr. Seuss tree. Here we see Adam and Eve expelled from the garden and their hard life as agricultural laborers and housewives or whatever after the fall. And here's the crucifixion. Notice again how the heads and upper bodies are in higher relief. They kind of step out of the relief. That's very typical of Carolingian sculpture. Think maybe Bishop Bornward got a look at Trajan's column as well? So from top to bottom, this tells the story of Jesus' life in 24 scenes, ending with his entry into Jerusalem. Interesting that that's the ending point, not the crucifixion, not the resurrection. Really, more of an echo of Roman history and Roman style, where triumphal entries were kind of the culmination, than it is of Christian history. Like the Carolingian rulers, the Ottonian rulers were looking for ways to emphasize the connection between their own kingdom and the historic Roman Empire. This slide really totally fails to capture what is most important about this sculpture, which is its monumental size, 6 feet tall. I mentioned that the migratory art that we looked at the beginning of this unit was generally small and portable. Or actually, at the beginning of this chapter, I should say. This image, on the other hand, sends a very strong symbol that the Saxon emperors are here to stay. They are going to build on a large scale, sculpt on a larger scale. This is another term you need to know. This statue was also a reliquary, which just means it was a repository for a sacred object. Sometimes these are bones or something else from saints. Remember the reliquary at the stupa, remains of the Buddha. In this case, there's a compartment in the back of the head that holds the host for communion, for the Mass. So how does this Ottonian image differ from Christ on the cross of the Lindau Gospels, which was created about 100 years earlier? Well, this Christ is older, like the Byzantine Christ. He's bearded. He's clearly suffering. He's dragged down by gravity. In fact, if you look at those pulled, strained muscles, I mean, it looks like he could be tearing away at any time. I was hoping this would blow up better than it did. It's a little hard to make this out from the blown-up head, but there is, in fact, you can see little bits of blood streaking down Christ's forehead. I suspect it would have been seen more strongly in the earlier version, and his head is sagging. This artist shrinks neither from Christ's humanity nor from his agony. So the Ottonians also carried on the art of the illuminated manuscript. We're going to see this all the way through the medieval period. And here again, typical of Ottonian and Carolingian art, the Holy Roman Empire of the West, we see some classical elements. So we see the molded legs, the flying drapery, the landscape in the background. On the other hand, the figures and landscape are highly stylized. Volume is mostly created with line, not color or shading, and we see the typical Byzantine golden sky. We saw the Byzantine elements in the illuminated manuscripts, such as the sky. That was no accident. Otto III was the son of a Saxon emperor and a Byzantine princess, and he valued his Byzantine roots. So note the similarity to the portrait of Justinian, although also note, you have the purple robe, the fibula, etc., but notice that Otto III is depicted as Justinian really is not, with hierarchy of scale. Otto III moved his capital to Rome and actually tried to recapture the glory of the Roman Empire, but he died very young. At his own request, I think it's interesting, he was buried beside Charlemagne at Aachen. Oops, I should have had that up. There's the comparison to Justinian. This isn't in your textbook, but I thought it was very interesting. This is another illumination from Otto III's Gospel book, which represents as 4 females, Slovenia, Germany, Gaul, and Rome, the provinces of Ottonian Rome, bringing tribute. Again, this is a very Roman image without the Roman naturalism. Okay, here's another one of those summary slides that I borrowed from another teacher. Understand these elements of the different kinds of art, what zoomorphic art is, cloisonne, interlace, etc. You've encountered all of these terms. Just be familiar with this summary. And this brings Unit 5 to an end. Whew! We are moving toward the High Middle Ages and some of the most spectacular churches ever built. Very appropriate as we also approach the seasons of Advent and Christmas. I'm now going to be preparing your test review podcast. Good luck on your Unit 5 test.